Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Oyster Fest 2020. We thank you for joining us for our 46th annual event. And while we are not able to serve you our oysters in person this year, we're providing the next best thing with programs that promote our history in this virtual format. I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors of the 2020 Oyster Festival, M&T Bank, the Friends of the York County History Center, CGA Law, Fulton Bank, York Water Company, the W. Dale Brocker Foundation, and Hanover Auto Team. We're very grateful for all of the support. I also want to thank the Oyster Festival Committee for their planning efforts into providing this online programming, including the Chef Showcase that we've featured throughout the past month, planning the road rally that takes us through southeastern York County, and offering fundraising support to make this year's event a success. Before I introduce our speaker today, I just want to take a moment to talk a little bit about the Zoom functions that we have going on today. This is a Zoom meeting, so we can see the participants that are with us today. If you do have a question, we ask that you share the chat, share using the chat feature, and then we will take your questions at the end or if there's time during the presentation. So Kate Livie is a professional Chesapeake educator and writer and historian. As an Eastern Shore native, she is passionate about the Chesapeake Bay's culture and landscape. Kate has written extensively about regional travel, history, and foodways for publications from Wooden Boat to Baltimore Magazine to Edible Delmarva. Her 2015 book, Chesapeake Oysters, The Bay's Foundation and Future, won the Maryland Historical Society's Marion Brewington Prize for Maritime History. Formerly the Director of Education and Associate Curator at the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum, she currently is adjunct faculty at Chestertown's Washington College, where she teaches courses about the Bay's environment, economy, and culture. Kate lives with her husband in her hometown of Chestertown, Maryland, and regularly thanks her lucky stars she gets to live, work, and play in the most wonderful place in the world, the Chesapeake Bay. So now I'm going to introduce Kate, and she'll take over.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. So I have a presentation that I'm going to go ahead and share. Thanks for joining us today. I'm really excited to talk about my favorite topic, oysters and the Chesapeake. So hang on one second while I get this set up. Okay. So I want to go back a few years to 2015 when I was writing my book, Chesapeake Oysters. And a lot of people have asked me why I decided to write a book on oysters. Oysters, are very delicious and not particularly beautiful. But the cool thing about oysters is they really connect the entire arc of history in the Chesapeake from the time period of the Native Americans to today in a way that not really any other resources, are something that we still feel so passionately about, that you can open up a newspaper in the Chesapeake today and still read about oysters being controversial. I mean, they've been a really important thread, connecting thread environmentally and culturally for 400 years or longer. So I want to take you on a little trip of our own today, exploring the oysters' role in, the culture, the traditions, the foodways, and the landscape of the Chesapeake Bay, going all the way back in time to the beginning. So this is an image from the end of a walk at Easter Neck Island, which is about 20 minutes from my house. You walk through this sort of salt meadow into this loblolly forest, and you end up at the mouth of the Chester River, overlooking the river, and you're standing on a beach made of oyster shells. And the oyster shells are what's known as a midden, which is essentially a Native American trash pile. There would have been an oyster reef right offshore, and Native Americans in the wintertime would have traveled to their winter hunting grounds. And those hunting grounds were normally adjacent to oyster shells or oyster reefs. So they could just wade out, pick up oysters, roast them on the beach. And over thousands of years, that habit and that tradition and that transition into winter and relying on oysters as a food way has left behind these sort of oyster beaches, these midden beaches throughout the Chesapeake Bay, which today may still be in areas where you no longer see oysters anymore. And so they're really kind of like a landscape ghost. They reflect an environment that's changed dramatically since the time period that the Native Americans experienced this particular aspect of the landscape. And one of the things that I look at these oyster shells and they remind me of is the really critical role that oysters played in the, incredibly abundant environment that the Native Americans would have known and that some of the first colonists encountered, like John Smith. These are really sort of like underwater castles. They turn the bottom of the Chesapeake Bay, which is very sandy, into this three-dimensional habitat. And I just want you to imagine kind of like an oyster castle that's, bigger on the bottom, that's been built up by one oyster growing on another over thousands of years so that they are exposed at low tide. And each of these oyster shells is covered in life. It's covered in gobies and mud crabs and, little sea worms. And then you've got bigger fish swimming around this oyster reef, and they're eating these smaller creatures. And then you've got even bigger fish that are swimming around and eating the smaller fish. So they're really what we consider sort of a environmental architect. They have created, sort of this entire food chain system that's all contingent upon their populations being strong. And I always like to think about this idea in the Chesapeake. We talk about rockfish. Elsewhere people refer to that species of fish as striped bass. But in the Chesapeake, we call them rockfish because watermen and would see them swimming around what they refer to as oyster rock. They called oyster reefs oyster rock, these big clumps, rock-like clumps of oysters. And so you'd see these big apex predator fish swimming around these oyster rock. And so that's how they got their nickname. But it's a reminder that, oysters were really this environmental engineer, and how important they would have been, not just to the environment, but then to the subsistence of the cultures that are living around the Chesapeake Bay in this time period. It's a very cool place, and anybody can go to this place. So Eastern Neck Island is a national wildlife refuge. So if you have the inkling and you want to come down to see it for yourself, you definitely can. I recommend it. So as we move forward into time, I took this shot at Jamestown. And when you think about the first sort of chapter in Chesapeake history after the Native Americans, or really sort of an overlap, that early colonial period is a time when I think a lot of us tend to think about pilgrims, and we think about, sort of early settlers, and there's this idea that they're, surviving off the land and they know how to do that. But the early settlers at Jamestown, really the first American colonists from England, had no real idea what they were doing. And they were dropped into the middle of this environment and expected to turn a profit as quickly as possible. And these are not people generally that were from, any farther than a mile or two radius from the place that they were born. They would never left that radius in their entire lives. So these are not people that, and they're coming from a really structured society where, if you were born the son of a cobbler, your grandfather was probably a cobbler and you were going to be a cobbler. So there wasn't this sense of like survival or living off the land. They were dropped into this totally foreign environment that they did not understand. There are accounts of, descriptions of, the flora and fauna that they would see. And they'd see, for example, there's like a description of like, this is the beast with the worm tail, furry beast. And, what they really mean is possum. But they didn't know what they were looking at. And they certainly didn't know if they could eat it. So take that and sort of extrapolate it to this understanding of like a savage landscape. I mean, from their perspective, they were coming from this sort of pastoral farming society, agricultural, into what they felt was a wilderness. But the one thing that they did recognize was oysters. So oysters had been a major foodway for the Romans. And so as the Roman Empire spread, they would find oysters, delicious oysters kind of wherever they managed to dominate. So they had Gallic oysters in France. And then when they got to England, they called them Raputan oysters. And so England actually has a history because of the Romans of oyster aquaculture, oyster consumption. By the time the Jamestown settlers arrive, Shakespeare's already written the words, "The world is mine oyster that I with a sword shall open." And there were probably people in the Globe Theater eating oysters while those words were spoken because they were a theater snack. So when they get to the Chesapeake, oysters become incredibly important because they may not recognize anything else in the landscape as edible, but they know they can eat oysters. And also, crucially, oysters are important because oysters don't run away, right? Like, they don't swim away, they don't run away. Everything else you have to chase, you have to catch, you have to hunt. But oysters can just go and be picked up. So early settlements like Jamestown are carpeted with oyster shells. Oysters were a really, really important survival food. The other important thing to consider is that oysters don't even really need to be preserved. You can eat them raw, out of the shell. We're eating them that way now. So they're pretty delicious. And they became this really important sort of survival food for early colonists. So many archaeologists will say that they will be able to recognize where they should dig in a colonial site, wherever the oysters are the densest, in that particular location. It indicates that, people were eating and discarding shells. And so from Jamestown on, oysters really played this important role. And they were a classless food in the sense that anybody could go out and get them. So you had people higher in society eating oysters. You had poor people, enslaved people eating oysters. They were really something that every level of society would have been eating in the 17th and the 18th century. So as we move forward into the 18th century, I want to start talking about the concept of, who was going to get oysters and how were they harvesting them. So this is a wonderful image of Virginia, of enslaved watermen harvesting oysters. And so oysters were, as populations grew, you really harvested the oysters that were available to just sort of wade out and pick up. And so you needed a different tool to use to get oysters that were further down in the water. So what they used are essentially what we call tongs, but really they're just two rakes stuck together like scissors that you lower down into the water and kind of scrape up a pile of oysters and bring them to the top. And they had these sort of low freeboard skiffs that they could lift the oysters up and over. But the thing to consider is that this is hard manual labor. This is backbreaking work. Even today, watermen who do this technique to harvest oysters, which is still done kind of amazingly, have like very distinctive muscle patterns on their back from harvesting oysters this way. And in the 18th century, basically, if you could afford to own someone who would do manual labor for you, you did. And so when you think about kind of the way that Chesapeake plantations sort of spread out, they were all along adjacent waterways. The waterways provided transportation, they provided food, access to trade, and you really don't see town development starting for a long time in the Chesapeake. And for the British, it was very sort of frustrating that, we didn't form towns in the Chesapeake, but as long as you had your own mini port, you didn't need to. And so it meant that for a lot of these plantations, which were based on a tobacco economy, you would have used slaves also and given them this work where they would go out and harvest from the Chesapeake, harvest oysters, harvest crabs, and harvest other seafood as part of their job. And it's interesting, a lot of the slaves in this region were coming from West Africa, where there's quite a lot of small tributaries, brackish water tributaries, perfect for oysters. So oysters were a familiar food to the slave population as well. And so when we really think about the idea of harvesting seafood in every season, and that becomes sort of synonymous in the 19th century with the term waterman, really the original watermen in the Chesapeake would have been enslaved, and they would have been enslaved Africans and later African Americans. So I love this image because it helps to tell that story. And when you think about later famous African Americans who managed to escape to freedom, often water was something that their knowledge of the waterways was something they were able to utilize, whether it's Harriet Tubman or Frederick Douglass. So there's a legacy connected to this work on the water for African Americans, starting all the way back in the 18th century, that has really shaped the tradition that we know today. So as we move through the 18th into the 19th century, we're moving into what's considered sort of the oyster boom in the Chesapeake Bay. And I want to preface this by saying that it was a gradual process. It really was trickled down from New England, where you already had large populations in Boston and New York. And as I mentioned earlier, Europeans were very fond of oysters, and there was a large oyster population, at the mouth of the Hudson River and some of the other tributaries in New England, but they had nothing on the scale of the Chesapeake, which is like oyster paradise. It's enormous also compared to every other, it's the largest tributary in North America. So you had these large populations in New York and Boston, and they were hungry for oysters, and very early they start to regulate the harvest of them because they're already starting to reduce the populations. There's just not enough oysters to go around. So, there's this kind of mindset. You just keep going a little bit further south if you work in the oyster industry, in the late 18th and early 19th century in New England. And so you have these oyster packers coming from New Haven, and they kept going further south and further south to harvest and, find oysters to harvest in these markets. And so by really the 1812, 1815, you see some of the first New England oyster boats arrive in the mouth of the Chesapeake in Virginia. And Virginians and people from this region then, as now, really disliked outsiders. So some of the first regulations about oysters are basically saying, these are our oysters. If you don't live here, get out. And so the Yankee, mindset was sort of like, well, they were entrepreneurial, and they're like, all right, well, if, God closes a door, he opens a window. And so they just sailed straight through Virginia into Maryland and started harvesting Maryland oysters instead. So then Maryland follows suit. And so again, these are sort of like, this entrepreneurial mindset. They're like, all right, well, we can get around that. We're just going to set up shop in Baltimore, and now we're Marylanders, and we're going to harvest all these oysters and sell them. And the timing was ideal because it's the 1830s by this point, and the B&O Railroad was starting to be established, growing out of Baltimore, which would provide this sort of crucial transportation network. Also coming along with the New Englanders was this new technology, canning, that had come from France. The French Navy had actually had basically a contest where there was an award for whoever could figure out how to preserve food on French naval vessels the longest. And this guy, Nicolas Appert, came up with this idea to can food. And so this idea of canning vegetables and seafood came to New York and then was brought to Baltimore. And so between, you had the transportation network, you had this new method of preservation, and you had now access to basically the country's largest stock of oysters. And those three things together created what we consider the oyster boom era. So all of a sudden, there was a reason to be in Baltimore, and Baltimore goes from being sort of a shipping port to being the center of this, canning, shipping, oyster shucking hub. And, you've got immigrants at this time period sort of flooding into the city. They're being, pressed into work in these packing houses, and new vessels are built to harvest the bounty. And, this is right around the same time period as the Civil War. So that transportation network is being expanded even further to get troops and munitions across the country. And that's going to be a huge boon for this industry. And so this was really a period where it was sort of like all hell broke loose. There was so much money to make in the oyster industry, whether you were harvesting oysters or you were a magnate packing oysters, whether you were working in Sparrows Point making the tin for the cans, lithographers making the art for the cans. It was like the Wild West. There were really no regulations. And so, this is a time period of intense prosperity for the Chesapeake. And it goes from just Baltimore to basically all these small towns start transforming into these huge like oyster explosions because of the fact that you wanted to get as close as possible to the resource, and that was going to be the most, sort of expedient way to harvest, process, and ship them. And so like all these backwaters like Crisfield and St. Michael's become, oyster packing hubs. They are in the middle of nowhere, but they are located, adjacent to some of the richest oyster areas in the Chesapeake Bay. So this is an image from a packing house in Baltimore, and the conditions in these packing houses were terrible. In Baltimore, you largely saw immigrant labor. Out on the Eastern Shore and in small towns around the Chesapeake, you largely saw African-American labor. It's after the Civil War, so you've got sort of this rush of immigration. You've also got these newly emancipated African-Americans that are looking for work. And so this is unskilled labor, but it's dangerous. I mean, the women in this image are wearing mob caps, but they're not wearing mob caps because it's a style choice. It's to keep your hair out of machinery that could scalp you. And so there's descriptions in this time period of sort of profitable, fat cat packing house owners talking, at like their, luncheons. There's transcripts from their speeches where they talk about, that they're keeping children as young as 6 off the streets by employing them in their packing houses, and so you've got small children that are working as migrant workers shucking oysters, in this time period where entire families would be sort of pressed into work in these very dark, wet, dirty conditions. And Baltimore itself, and so many towns around the Chesapeake were really, this was sort of like the town that Oysters built. Literally, like in towns like St. Michael's and Crisfield, they were referred to like a shabby Venice. The idea is that layers and layers of oyster shells would create new dry ground for you to build more packing houses on. And in places like Baltimore, if you visit Baltimore today and go to the Inner Harbor seems like actually rather sterile and sort of empty, and you're not really sure what was supposed to be there. And this is what was supposed to be there. These oyster boats stacked up 5 deep, coming in, loaded down with oysters, selling them to packing houses. Packing houses were shucking, shipping, selling them all across the United States. Fun fact for those of you that know about oyster plates. So oyster plates are very collectible today. And, I found sort of like women's, housekeeping manuals that suggested that you have 8 of them. And this was like a woman's housekeeping manual in Iowa. So what it suggests is these oyster plates can be found all over the country, and they were not for oysters on the half shell, they were for oysters in a can. And if you've ever seen canned oysters, they are truly terrible to witness. And they're very delicious. There's nothing against them. I've eaten them, but they are not attractive. So the idea is you have these oyster plates that you can sort of ladle your oysters out into to make them look pretty, and you can collect them all over the country because basically any place that a train went, oysters could go. So we were really feeding the nation our oyster shells. And I love this image because when I say that this is the land that Oysters built, I mean, this guy is literally standing on a huge pile of oyster shells. And you can see the men behind him coming out with wheelbarrows full of oyster shells. Oyster shells ended up being used in all sorts of ways, not just to create infill. I mean, there were what we call corduroy roads. Roads were built out of, sort of a strip of a log and then oyster shell and then another log to create this sort of like, bumpy effect. Oyster shells were used in chicken feed. Oyster shells were used as buttons. You name it. There was a huge production, every part of the oyster was used, which what we didn't realize at the time was that by using all of those oysters, we're essentially robbing the bay of that sort of, when I talk about those oyster castles, we're essentially breaking those down and taking them all away. And so we start in this 19th century, we really start to transform the bay's ecology and, in this sort of single-minded pursuit for oysters. And this is an image, again, that just gives you a sense of how sort of widespread this practice was. It was happening all over the Chesapeake, not just in Baltimore. So all the way down to Norfolk, on the Eastern Shore, communities were really built around this harvest And from, the packing house worker to African-American watermen in small log canoes, all the way up to skipjacks and bug-eyes, there was a tremendous amount of money to make, and everybody was out to make as much as possible. If you visit Crisfield, Maryland today, one of the things you'll notice is all the houses are Victorian houses, but they were all built, it really looks around the same time. And they were all built with oyster money. There was just so much money to make. Now, the incentive to make money and the lack of really, there was really a very small law. So the law was established right after the Civil War with the idea that they needed to have some type of orderly harvest. And so what was known as county waters, basically shallow water, was reserved for people that were in log canoes, people were tongers essentially. And then if you worked in state waters, deeper waters, then you could use bigger boats with big technology, big tools called oyster dredges. And oyster dredges could, harvest, 5 times the amount of oysters as a tonger in the same amount of time. They were incredibly efficient. They scraped oysters right off the bottom. They used sail power to navigate. And so really that was the only restriction. You didn't really have to throw any back. There weren't like any size requirements. There was no season. But even that was too much regulation for this time period. And so this is what we consider, the late 19th century is when we see the outbreak of what we call the Oyster Wars, or at least that's what the New York Times called it. So this is an image from Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, which was kind of like the Us Weekly of the 19th century. And, rather than call them poachers, they used all this terminology. It was meant to make it look very dramatic. It's Oyster Wars, and it's not poachers, it's pirates. But it was really, people were shooting and killing each other over these conflicts. So the handsome man with the whiskers on the right-hand side is Hunter Davidson, and he was appointed the head of what they called the Oyster Navy. I can't make these terms up. They're so awesome. So Hunter Davidson is given the job of having to police these waters and make sure that, you don't have dredgers in Tongers area and vice versa. But there was so much money to make, you actually had dredgers working together to create kind of these like outlaw gangs of poachers that would go into shallower waters and harvest oysters. They would, you'd find a whole fleet of them, and there'd be one guy at the, the mouth of the river with a lantern to signal the others if the Oyster Navy was coming. You had tremendous conflicts where people are, being what they called, shanghaied essentially and paid off by the boom, where instead of like paying your workers on your boat, you would tack really suddenly and the boom would swing around and hit them on their head and they'd drown, and then you wouldn't have to pay them. So there was all sorts of like crime happening, like from small to large, and it's really dramatic. So there's a really famous example of a gunfight on the Chester River, which is where I live, where there's, Hunter Davidson actually comes in on, this steamer to apprehend this group of poachers run by this outlaw named Gus Rice. And so the outlaws don't try to run away. They have metal plates on their boats and they turn and they return the fire, not knowing that on the steamer they have a howitzer and they lay into everyone, and all these, people flee. It's a crazy, confusion, boats sink. You've got oystermen climbing on the deck screaming, I won't oyster anymore. This is all written up in the New York Times. So all around the country, you had this awareness of, the dramatic and deadly, conflicts that were happening on the Chesapeake over oysters. And you've got to think like all this sort of lawlessness and this incentive to harvest as many as possible means that very quickly the oyster populations started to decline. So really you only see like a 40-year, maybe 35-year window of increased harvest numbers before there starts to become this market decline. And it's because of, and they start to institute some very light regulations. The idea that, you needed to throw back some of your shells, that, you had to harvest in certain months. But it was too little too late. And the oyster population really started to fall after the turn of the century, which was really concerning for everybody working in the oystering industry that had so much money to make harvesting oysters. So this handsome oyster-inspired man. This is William K. Brooks. He's a researcher at Johns Hopkins University, which was a new university at the time. And he was hired by the state of Maryland and Virginia in a sort of a fish commission to study oyster reproduction because they needed more oysters. The oysters were being depleted and they were so important. At one point, 25% of Maryland's population worked in some way with the oyster industry. So saving the oyster, it was like too big to fail. And so the idea was that they were going to hire William K. Brooks, and William K. Brooks was going to figure out how to make more oysters because they really had no clue. They did not know. So he literally got hired to figure out how oysters do it. So he goes down and he's sent down by the state of Maryland in a barge off of Crisfield, and he studies oyster reproduction for a full summer, and he has this eureka moment. He realizes that oysters reproduce externally. And he was so excited. You know, I've figured it out. He's so excited. He goes to the newspapers, and the newspapers write it up as the Maryland oyster refuses to be tied to its mother's apron strings, which is just so ridiculous. They did not get it, basically. He had figured out that the solution was actually pretty simple. You just kind of get oysters ready to reproduce in the same area, and they reproduce externally, and you can have this huge cloud of larvae and they can settle and reproduce. It doesn't happen internally. You don't have to worry about it. It's like fish reproduction. So this is huge because it means that farming oysters would actually be like pretty easy, but the newspapers don't get it at all. So he, instead of being dispirited, William K. Brooks sits down and he decides to write a book that's written for sort of like the armchair scientists. And there were lots of people like this in the 19th century, people who, you know, collected ferns and studied electricity. And you've got to think, like, in this time period, science wasn't like a profession. It was in some ways a hobby. And so he's going to appeal to all these sort of well-heeled armchair scientists by writing this book, The Oyster. And so he fills it with beautiful images. On the right-hand side, you can see one of his sketches of sort of an oyster anatomy. He talks about oysters farmed in France, oysters farmed in Europe, oyster reproduction. He gets into it all. And then finally, he publishes the book, and then he waits. And it is a huge success. All these people are reading this book. They think it's so interesting. It becomes very influential. There's a lawmaker in Maryland that actually decides, he's so inspired by this book, he decides that his name is Howard Hayman, and he's going to pass a bill to try to make basically oyster farming happen in the Chesapeake, in Maryland. And it passes. It passes in 1904. And Virginia is very inspired by it as well, and they decide to do the same thing. So we should have, like, from 1904 on, we should have technically have had oyster farming in the Chesapeake. But the problem is that the oyster industry was really against this idea of changing to oyster farming, because it would change everything about all of their equipment, their process. You know, this entire economy was sort of set on the idea that you went out and found oysters and harvested them wherever they were available, and they were wild, and you didn't farm them. And so, I mean, there's such strong sentiment against this change that in 1912, they actually roll it back and make oyster farming illegal in different parts of Maryland. Meanwhile, Virginia's just full steam ahead, and they start like farming oysters gangbusters. And at the same time, what ends up happening is that they're successfully farming oysters, and so they end up having to have these sort of regulations and restrictions to stop poachers from coming across the state line from Maryland to take their oysters. So it's so dramatic. You actually have people building, they have leases where they're farming oysters. They actually build houses on stilts above their lease so they can keep an eye out for oyster poachers. And so poor William K. Brooks, you know, he, although very influential, he is largely forgotten today, but he was really the sort of the great grandfather of oyster farming in the Chesapeake. And it really represented kind of the first time that the Chesapeake oyster industry looked to science for a solution to solve its population problem. So in the meantime, we're going to jump ahead a little bit. we actually, after William K. Brooks, there's sort of what ends up happening for 50 years or so is that essentially the Chesapeake becomes a much more diversified seafood industry. And that really has to do with refrigeration. So refrigeration's developed right around the turn of the century. And what it means is that now you can have oysters in the winter, right? And then in the summertime, you can harvest this other resource that up until now you really couldn't preserve at all, which was crabs. So now there becomes sort of a seasonal industry for all different kinds of seafood. And you don't just have oystermen, you now have, you know, watermen that harvest oysters in the winter, fish in the spring, you know, crabs in the summer into the fall, and then oysters again in this big circle. And that diversification takes a lot of the pressure off of oysters to be the be all end all of the oyster economy. So it actually, the harvest sort of levels out and the population levels out as well. And we really enter this sort of very sustainable period that lasts until the 1960s. The problem is we got really comfortable with playing God in that interim. Basically what happens is we start this, what we call the shell and seed program. So there becomes this restriction, you know, right after the Hayman Act and all that stuff was gutted, that you needed to save your shell. And the idea is you could go and you could put it back out in the water and it would encourage other oysters to grow on it. Oysters want to be attached to hard substrate. And so that worked. And the other thing you could do is you could take, if you had like kind of a weak oyster area and then you had oysters that were doing really well in another area, you know, another tributary, you just move the oysters around. So watermen were actually hired by the state to do this, to move oysters, to move shell, and they started out kind of moving them, you know, from one tributary to another, then from Virginia to Maryland. And then we started to start large scale moving oysters around. Well, you know, the oysters are doing really well in the Gulf. It's the same species. Let's just move it into the Chesapeake Bay. What about these oysters from Delaware Bay? And what we didn't realize we were doing at the time is that we were actually bringing non-native oyster diseases into the Chesapeake Bay. So the first non-native oyster disease that we introduced was dermo, and that came from Gulf oysters. And a few years later, from Delaware Bay, they introduced oyster disease they called mononucleated sphere unknown, or MSX. They didn't know what the hell that was. And these two oyster diseases were activated by high salinity water. So they were brought into Virginia first, and they started to kill the oysters there. And then that shell and seed program continued forward because they thought, the thinking at the time was that by moving the oysters into the fresher waters of the upper Chesapeake, the oysters there wouldn't get sick. It was too fresh. Except then there was a drought, and the drought made the salinity rise higher in the Chesapeake Bay north. And so it meant that it was like it awakened the disease in the oysters that had been moved into the upper part of the Chesapeake. And basically you had this huge oyster collapse. And the oyster collapse really, you know, really started in the 70s and continued through the 80s and the 90s. And these two diseases just, you know, really crippled the oyster industry. When we think about how do we get where we are now, where, you know, we talk about sort of declining populations of oysters, it has everything to do with these two diseases and really very little to do with the over-harvesting at the turn of the century. So these two diseases put the state, both states, in the situation of now having to be like, all right, what are we going to do about oysters? Maybe science can help us. And so for the second time, there was this thought about, you know, maybe we can solve this by, you know, and initially the thought was maybe we can solve it by bringing in a non-native oyster. And that's really what's happened around the world whenever you see oyster populations decline because of diseases, you just bring in a different oyster. Now, in the Chesapeake, what had happened in the meantime was we had figured out we needed oysters not just for the oyster economy, we needed oysters for the environment. We'd realized that sort of in, you know, as the bay's water quality really declined in the second half of the 20th century, oysters could be one of the solutions to, you know, bad water quality. They are natural filter feeders. They're, you know, eating algae. They're settling sediment. They're, you know, they do so much good for the environment. And so there was a resistance to bringing in a non-native oyster because we weren't sure what they would do. Will they ruin the Chesapeake? Will they upset the ecological balance? You know, Is it going to be like a rabbits in Australia scenario? So environmental organizations, they started in the 70s around Earth Day, and by the 80s were really vocal and against the idea of bringing in a non-native oyster. So what they decided to do is they'd study it. This is the second time science has been approached as a solution for oyster problems in the Bay. And basically out of the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, you had a researcher that basically for a year studied, this non-native oyster, and he created a control. You had all these native oysters, Crassostrea virginica, just dying of disease. So he wanted to see, okay, if we put these two oysters side by side in the same conditions, how does this other oyster do, in the same environment? And to make sure that the oysters didn't reproduce, he made them both sterile, so that the whole point is you don't want the non-native oyster to reproduce while you're doing your study if you don't want it to be released into the environment. So he studies them for a year, and he has his own eureka moment. He pulls up the bags at the end of the year. The non-native oysters look great, doing great, they're doing fine. But then you also had the native oysters were still alive. They should be dead because of disease. And what he realized was that if you made it so that oysters never reproduced, the Chesapeake oyster, native oyster, did not reproduce, it didn't expend any energy on reproduction, it could actually live long enough to be harvested. It could survive long enough, not forever, but long enough to be harvested. You didn't necessarily need to bring in a non-native oyster if we could just make sterile versions of the oyster we already had. And so he was able in a hatchery to create these sterile oysters, or like, seedless grapes, and start distributing them to Virginia watermen. They were already used to oyster leasing, so they started growing them in floats like the one in the photos that you see. And all of a sudden, overnight, it was the solution. It was the silver bullet. You could have this oyster industry, and you could have these oysters that were resistant to disease, but you just had to make sure they were sterile. And so, within the first 5 years, you had a 5,000 increase in the use and production of sterile oysters. Crassostrea virginica, native oysters, just sterile. Maryland had a little bit more of a problem because they had actually made it illegal in a lot of the Chesapeake, their part of the Chesapeake, to grow oysters. So, Martin O'Malley in 2009 pushes forward with this new sort of regulation that's going to open Maryland up to oyster farming, so that they can, raise oysters like this, sell them on the half shell market, like the kind of oysters that you might see, in a high-end oyster restaurant. And so there's a lot going on in this picture, and I'm going to explain it to you. So, you still have this traditional watermen's community that's going out and harvesting wild oysters the way they always had. The wild oyster population, although in decline and not, as populous nearly at all as, at much reduced levels, is still there. And there are just fewer watermen to harvest them. So what O'Malley proposed was two things. He proposed making oyster farming easier and, kind of creating a pathway to oyster farming. But then he also had this other idea that oysters needed to be, kind of left alone in the environment so that they could restore their populations of their own and ideally build up some natural resistance. So he puts the map you see in the upper right-hand corner he puts 25% of Maryland's oyster bottom into sanctuary. So he's going to create oyster sanctuaries where basically it can go back to building up natural oyster castles. And to help them get off the bottom, he actually brings in, and you can see in the boat on the upper left-hand side, he brings in vessels full of oyster shells to help rebuild that kind of three-dimensional bottom environment. And they meet a lot of resistance from traditional watermen who, they're not allowed to oyster in these oyster sanctuaries. You can farm oysters, but you cannot go in and dredge. And so the headlines that you see in the photo on the lower left-hand side really reflect kind of this, the modern oyster wars, which are this sort of the conflict between the way that we've traditionally harvested oysters in the Chesapeake for over 150 years and this kind of new model that we're moving into, where you see this hybrid of, oysters harvested by watermen for kind of the packing house shucked market, like the kind you get to make oyster stew out of. And then you see this new oyster farmer, you know, coming out of this new legislation. And these are people that are selling these sort of beautifully hand-raised oysters for like the white tablecloth market. So it's this huge diversification, and it's all changed in the last 15 years. So in conclusion, and I've covered a lot of history, and thanks for hanging on with me throughout this entire talk, we are really in kind of an oyster renaissance. We have more oysters of more varieties from throughout the Chesapeake Bay than we've ever had before. And the thing that I always like to say to really anybody who's listening to me talk about oysters is that this is oysters are an important part of our environment, but they can also still be both an important part of our environment and our economy. And the thing to consider when you spend your dollars on oysters, you should do it in a way that's really thoughtful. You know, if you want to see, I mean, we are living in where oysters are harvested for consumption. So as a consumer, you have all the power. Do you think you want to support a traditional industry, then you can buy oysters from watermen. If you want to see more aquaculture, then you buy oysters from an oyster farm. And just like, you know, when you think about the choices that you make about the chicken you eat or the beef or where it comes from, the milk and eggs you consume, you know, being more aware of where your seafood comes from, and understanding the choices that you make when you spend your money on where and what kind of seafood you purchase does have a direct impact on, you know, what the future of the Chesapeake Bay is going to be. But there's been no better time to be an oyster consumer. So, you know, we are now officially in an R month, which means it's oyster time. So I'd encourage everybody to get out there and, you know, help yourself. I hope I made you hungry. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if there's any questions. If anybody has any questions for me, please feel free to go ahead and drop them into the chat. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. And if not, then thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Kate.
You're welcome.
Any questions? Well, it's a great presentation, and it's nice to have an understanding of how the history of the Chesapeake oysters came about throughout the years, and it's easy to understand how we came about having an oyster festival because during the archaeology dig that we did in the 1960s, they found oyster shells. And so it seems that it's very well in line with the mountains of oyster shells that were in Baltimore, that many of them did come up here to enjoy some oysters as well.
Yeah, oysters travel very well overland for sure. So it's not a surprise that you find them at your site at all.
All right, well, if there are no questions, I think we'll wrap things up, and I want to thank you all for participating in this year's.
Oh, wait, we do have a question.
Oh, there's one.
Okay, thanks, David, for mentioning that. So, I mean, on a large scale, sediment and pollution, I mean, when we say pollution, I don't want you to think of like chemical pollutants, it's more nutrient pollution. So the Chesapeake really since World War II has, you know, when we introduced chemical fertilizers, has really suffered from the way that our farming industry has transitioned to become a global economy. So there's a lot of pressure on every acre to yield as much as possible. And historically, we really didn't understand that the environment needed to be protected at all. So it's sort of like if you had arable farmland, you just sort of fertilize and they're like, this is a silver bullet. What we didn't realize was happening is that the way that historically we farmed in the Chesapeake meant that there was a ton of runoff, a lot of sediment, a lot of nutrients flowing into the Chesapeake Bay. And because the watershed is so enormous, regulating it was really hard because it had to be Pennsylvania and Virginia and Maryland, you know, and really in places that had no visible connection to the Bay, like they don't feel, I mean, if you live in like Cooperstown, do you feel like you're part of the Chesapeake? I mean, you are, but you don't feel like it. So what we saw in the later part of the 20th century is really this increasing issue with sedimentation and nutrients. And the watershed sort of moment, pun intended, was Hurricane Agnes in 1972, which many people can remember. And it just in one storm, one spring hurricane, this sort of freak occurrence, it just completely blanketed the bottom of the bay in sediment. And it was right around the time that, that event happened right around Earth Day, 1970. There's this awareness and awakening about the importance of the environment just for in and of itself, not because it was productive, not because it was like holding up the economy. And so in response, you start to see this research being done on kind of what can be done about it. And in 1988, there's a researcher at Horn Point Labs who is the first person to understand that, like, oh, oysters actually eat the algae that's growing because of nutrient pollution, and they can filter up to like 50 gallons of water a day of sediment pollution and kind of spit it out in the form of like these little pellets called pseudofeces. So they'll like move it through their whole digestive system and spit it out. And then the water, like if you put them in a tank of dirty water, they'll clean it in a couple hours, like Windex clean. So the oysters really became seen as one solution, not, the only solution, but one solution to the sediment and nutrient issue. And so, even more, their populations were really important because they're part of what, it turns out, helps keep the bay in balance. So that's part of the reason that like oyster sanctuaries and things like that have been established. So basically there's kind of like no-go zones in the bay where nobody's harvesting oysters and they can just do that job. So that's a long explanation for a short question, but I hope that helps you understand a little bit more.
Great. Thank you, David. I do want to mention before we sign off today that we have other events scheduled for the rest of this week. So be sure to check out our website, yorkhistorycenter.org, for the schedule of events, including our Zoom happy hour tomorrow evening at 5 o'clock. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we are doing a road rally. It's our socially distant road rally in support of this year's Oyster Festival. We're running it now through the end of October. It takes you through southeastern York County, where you learn about some of the historic sites while answering some trivia questions. Registration is $25 per car, and it's a great way to support the festival, but also get out and enjoy the fall colors. Again, you want to go to our Oyster Festival page to register or for more information. Thank you again for joining us for this program, and thank you, Kate, for an informative presentation.
Thanks, Carrie.
Sure. Programs like these are made possible through generous donations of history-minded community members like yourself, and I would hope you would consider making a donation at yorkcountyhistorycenter.org to help support the creation of future content. With that, we'll be signing off, and thank you again.